Expertise poses a problem for democracy. Today, we will examine this by looking at a debate between the philosopher John Dewey and the journalist Walter Lippmann. Dewey and Lippmann disagreed about how democracy functioned. Lippmann contended that democracy was mediated by the fact that people don't have direct access to the world. Indeed, he said, they form their opinion and beliefs through the views and arguments of others. Also, he claimed that government is structured by the competition of special interests rather than by the desires of the people. Given the complexity of the modern world, informing and educating the public sufficiently to make them full and equal participants in a democracy was impossible, according to Lippmann. The solution to this would be to establish a disinterested group of social scientists whose communal commitment to the facts would help guide the machinery of government, guide elites, and filter information to the public. Elites and leaders would then serve not simply the special interests of one or another group, but society as a whole. Ultimately, the decisions would be made not by the public, but by elites. But it wouldn't be interested elites making the decisions, but it would be scientific elites. The public's role then would be only to set the procedures and rules that the elites would use to make decisions. In contrast, let's look at Dewey. Dewey says that everybody can be an expert. Everyone would evaluate information on his or her own terms, but they would use the critical method that he saw as defining the scientific method. By this definition, all parts of life can be scientific. The issue for Dewey was simply critical thinking. So this is not like Taylorism, which is applying a single method of time and motion studies everywhere. Instead, for Dewey, the meaning of science is more flexible. For him, it boils down essentially to suspended judgment, to skepticism, to desire for evidence, to appeal to observation rather than to sentiment, to discussion rather than bias, and to inquiry rather than conventional idealization. So it is clear then that the existence of science not only makes for the modern world, but this debate between Dewey and Lippmann indicates some of the stakes for democracy itself. However, if the stakes were high in the 1920s when this debate occurred, they were raised even higher in the 1930s and early 1940s. In the 1930s, expertise was itself a problem for cultural unity. Consider the Conference on Science, Philosophy, and Religion, which met at the outbreak of World War II. The conference's participants, over 150 leading academics, theologians, politicians, and social commentators who gathered annually, made a point of discussing how they, with all the varied philosophies and specialties they represented, embodied the problem that they were trying to solve. They saw their own differences of expertise as undermining the stability of the world, and participants even charged one another at the same conference with the responsibility for the rise of fascism and abetting totalitarianism. It was thus critical, in their shared goal of developing a common culture for American society, to find a resolution to the differences they represented. They asked, was the spirit of free inquiry or spiritual and religious values more directly tied to democracy? Or was democracy based on Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish faith in the dignity of man? Did secular or religious values hold more promise as a way to unify culture? High stakes were indicated by this man, David Lilienthal, who was director of the Tennessee Valley Authority. He went so far as to attribute the cause of the current world war to disunity produced by modern culture. In blaming disunity, Lilienthal meant something more specific than the rivaling ideologies of the Allied and Axis powers during World War II. He meant that the modern world had been fragmented by its high degree of specialization of function. For illustration, Lilienthal pointed to the various experts working for him at the TVA, specialists in fields ranging from electrical engineering to soil chemistry and dendrology. Expertise was a central fact in modernity, and in Lilienthal's view, that expertise had become a barrier to meaningful communication, preventing people with different disciplinary trainings from understanding one another's work. Remarkable as it may now seem that a high-ranking public official would locate the root cause of World War II not in Hitler's imperialistic ambitions, but in modernity's excessive specialization, Lilienthal was actually addressing an audience who felt just as he did. The conference had been formed out of the view that modernization, brought about by the growth of science and technology, had produced a dangerous loss of common culture. That is, intellectual and spiritual disunity was chiefly responsible for what they saw as the current world crisis, and it was the largest threat from which America was to be guarded. In fact, Lilienthal and the conference were representatives of a broader national sentiment which held that the root cause of the modern world's ills was its fragmented and intellectual culture. On this view, the proper way to cure the world and national problems was to change culture. Debates over the intellectual directions that countries should take occurred perhaps in their strongest form over educational policy and curriculum design. If rooting out modernity's problems meant changing intellectual culture and fashioning a proper mental landscape for American citizens in their formative years surely had to be part of the cure. A report put out by the Educational Policies Commission, or EPC, was a policymaking group appointed by the National Education Association, expressed a view similar to Lilienthal's, that the war had not been chiefly caused by the machinations of evil men, but was largely the result of profound dislocations in the culture and social structure caused by advances in science and technology. To address these dislocations, the EPC recommended curricular innovations that would unify American students' educational experience and provide them with a foundation for their future lives as citizens. Like the Conference on Science, Philosophy, and Religion, who sought to unify American culture by reconciling their own intellectual differences, members of the EPC placed responsibility on intellectuals to produce unity in a diverse nation, which they would do by offering a properly designed educational experience. In calling for curricular innovation as a means to unify the nation, the EPC lent authority to a sentiment that was already in wide circulation. Precisely what form that innovation would take, however, was a contentious and long debated question. To the intellectuals, educators, and policymakers who were involved in the debate, the stakes were particularly high. Resolution would determine what students encountered in their classroom, what kinds of people they would become, and the ultimate shape of society. It was not just the character of an abstract intellectual culture that was under discussion, but also what kinds of minds made for citizens who would keep democracy safe in a modern society infused by technology. This brings us to the debate over liberal education and general education. To think about this debate, we have to know about Charles Eliot. Eliot was a professor at chemistry and then the 21st president of Harvard University. He introduced the elective system. Before Eliot, there weren't majors and there weren't electives. Everyone took the same thing. After Eliot, every student could choose to take whatever course they wanted. All that mattered was that they had enough credits to graduate. By the 1930s, this seemed to create the very problem that David Lilienthal had complained about, what people called cafeteria education. Some students chose to fill their plates with only one thing, meat, others only with desserts, others only vegetables. Not only did this kind of educational curriculum seem unhealthy, but there was the problem of unity. No one was eating the same stuff or even tasting what other people were eating. The answer to this problem around the 1930s was two different approaches. The first was liberal education. This was the return to integration via reintroduction of the Western civilization. This was an effort to teach students through a great book's curriculum. It was associated with Catholic education. The idea was that the good and the right is given in advance, and it is the job of education for the student to learn the good and the right. In some ways, this is sort of like how you would learn mathematics. 2 + 2 = 4, and it's the job of the student to learn this fact. The problem with this kind of education is science. It's hard to do serious current science via teaching students timeless classics. The second approach to cafeteria education, or solving the problem of cafeteria education, was general education. This approach sought to teach students through connecting their curriculum to life skills. Here, the integration of the curriculum would be through the experience and interests that students had in practical use of what they learned in college. In the late 1930s, advocates of liberal education on one side and general education on the other each charged the opposing camp with fascism. On the one hand, advocates of liberal education said that their kind of education stood for values and morals and truth, and this was equal to democracy. On the other hand, advocates of the general education curriculum argued that what was democratic was questioning authority, and that itself was democratic. So we have two different approaches to solving the problem of cafeteria education. The synthesis would be provided by a new version of general education. This was offered by Harvard University in 1943 with its publication of a book called General Education in a Free Society. They suggested that the problem of science would be solved by treating science as one of several mental traits. Therefore, students would not have to know things, or to know the great books, or even to know facts. In this version of general education, the problem of expertise would be managed by treating general education as training students to select experts. It would be like learning a language. It would be like learning enough French to see who is a good writer in French. The idea was that we were all experts. We're all experts, but not of the same kind. Note, this is not what Dewey thought. This is not education where everybody should be, as he put it, scientific. In the Harvard view of general education, science and literature were not the same. Literature could not be made scientific, but both literature and science required expertise, but expertise of different sorts. As I put it in the report, quote, there are standards and a style for every type of activity, manual, athletic, intellectual, or artistic, and the educated man should be one who can tell sound from shoddy work outside his own field. The report concluded, the aim of general education may be defined as that of providing the broad critical sense by which to recognize competence in any field. The field may be literature, it may be science, it may be plumbing, but someone equipped with general education can judge good work in any one of these areas. The report put it this way. Since a single man cannot become an expert in every so many fields of human endeavor, mastery consists in the ability to recognize and choose the expert. What is called common or liberal education is just this ability. It is like the ability in democracy to govern ourselves. A layman is not necessarily an expert in government, but he is, or we hope is, an expert in choosing experts in government. He can appoint them and he can disappoint them. Ultimately, the Harvard model of general education won the day, swaying other colleges and even the federal government. Today, our distribution requirements in most colleges follow the logic set out by the Harvard general education system. That is, the problems that expertise pose for unity and for democracy would be solved by everybody learning to think in the language of science, in the language of humanities, and in the language of the social sciences. Equipped with the skills of these several languages, citizens of America would be prepared to defend democracy in a modern technological age.